In this video, we're going to talk about the globally harmonized system revisions to the Hazardous Communication Standard. The topics that are going to be discussed are who is going to be affected, the effective dates and requirements, labeling requirements, pictograms, safety data sheets, standardized 16-section format, and employee training. By revising the HAZCOM standard, it will now align with the GHS by reducing the number of labeling systems, standardize the safety data sheets, and also make it easier to understand information about hazardous chemicals. The revision to the HAZCOM standard affects manufacturers, distributors, importers, employers, and employees. Manufacturers, distributors, and importers have to change to the new SDS information and format. They also have to change their container labeling. Employers are required to train their employees on the changes to the SDS, formerly known as the MSDS or Material Safety Data Sheets, to the SDS, Safety Data Sheets, and the standardized 16-section format. They also need to train their employees to be able to read the new container labels. Employees need to be able to recognize and understand hazards based on information in the new SDS format, pictograms and container labels, also precautionary and hazard statements. In this slide, it shows the effective dates, the requirements, and who is responsible for them. By December 1st, 2013, employers are required to train all their employees on the new label elements and the safety data sheet format. Between June 1st and December 1st, 2015, compliance with all modified provisions of the final rule except the distributors shall not ship containers labeled by the chemical manufacturer or importer unless it has a GHS label. The responsible party would be the chemical manufacturers, importers, distributors, and employers. By June 1st, 2016, the employers are required to update alternative workplace labeling and hazard communication program as necessary and provide additional employee training for newly identified physical or health hazards. Now we're going to move into chemical classifications. Some of the health hazards would be acute toxicity, skin corrosion, respiratory or skin sensitization, germ cell mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity, specific target organ toxicity, single exposure or repeated exposure, aspiration, and simple asphyxiants. Now moving into your physical hazards. The physical hazards would be explosives, flammable aerosols, flammable liquids, oxidizing gases, gases under pressure, such as compressed gases, liquefied gases, and refrigerated liquefied gases. Now we're going to move into the environmental hazards. The environmental hazards, such as aquatic toxicity acute, means material to cause adverse effects in a short period of time. Aquatic toxicity chronic means material to cause adverse effects over a longer period of time. You also have your hazardous to the ozone layer. Now we're going to take a look at the old label requirements and the new label requirements. The diagram that you see on the left is a current OSHA standard which covers the material identity, hazard warnings, and supplier information. The diagram on the right is the updated OSHA GHS standard, which includes your product identifier, your signal word, a hazard statement, precautionary statements, pictograms, supplier information, and supplemental information. There are several new label elements such as symbols called pictograms, signal words such as danger or warning, hazard statements, precautionary statements, product identification, and supplier and manufacturer identification. This is an example of a new label style that is to appear on product labels beginning no later than June 1st, 2015, or December 1st, 2015 for distributors who still have product in inventory after June 1st, 2015 deadline. The type of required information is noted in blue. The actual statements and information will vary depending on specific health and physical classification of the product. Now we're going to move into pictograms and health hazards. These two pictograms are specific to acute toxicity or short-term exposure. The skull and crossbones is for any substance that is classified as having acute toxicity in health hazard category 1 to 3. The acute toxicity health class category 4, or least hazardous, is represented by an exclamation mark. If the substance is properly labeled, these two pictograms will never appear on the same label. It will be one or the other, with skull and crossbones representing the more severe hazard. Employees should be familiar with the pictogram for corrosion on the left. Note that the corrosive pictogram used to designate corrosion to metal is the same pictogram used for skin corrosion, serious eye damage, eye irritation under the health hazard classification. The pictogram on the right is called a health hazard and is represented by the silhouette of a person with a starburst across the chest. This is used to indicate that the substance is a chronic and/or target organ hazard. The pictogram on the left represents explosives, self-reactive, and organic peroxides. The pictogram on the right represents flammables, self-reactive, pyrophoric, or ignite when exposed to air, self-heating, omits flammable gases, organic peroxides such as catalyst and curing agents. The pictogram on the left represents hazardous to the aquatic environment. The pictogram on the bottom represents gases under pressure, such as liquefied gases that could displace the atmosphere. The pictogram on the right represents an oxidizer. Oxidizers are chemicals that can emit oxygen and increase the risk of a fire. Now we're going to move into signal words. These are words used to indicate the severity of the hazard and alert employees to the potential hazards. Only two signal words will appear: danger, which is more severe, and warning, which is less severe. Not all labels will have a signal word. Some chemicals are not hazardous enough to require that a signal word appear on the label. In the past, there have been several signal words that may have been used to indicate a hazard, such as caution, warning, and danger. With the new revisions, the GHS permits the use of only two signal words: danger and warning. There will only be one signal word on the label no matter how many hazards a chemical may have. An example, if a particular chemical has a hazard that warrants a danger and another hazard within that chemical which warrants a warning, then only danger should appear on the label. Now we're going to move into the hazard statements. There are specific hazard statements that must appear on the label based on the chemical hazard classification. Some examples would be flammable liquid and vapor, causes skin irritation, and may cause cancer. A hazard statement means a statement assigned to a hazard class and category that describes the nature of the hazard or hazards of a chemical, including where appropriate, the degree of the hazard. Precautionary statements. Precautionary statements describe recommended measures that should be taken to protect against hazardous exposures or improper storage or handling of a chemical. Some examples would be: wear respiratory protection, wash with soap and water, store in a well-ventilated place. It's not necessarily a mandate for employees to follow. Precautionary statement means a phrase that describes recommended measures that should be taken to minimize or prevent adverse effects resulting from exposure to a hazardous chemical or improper storage or handling. The employer is to evaluate the precautionary statements to determine if these need to be followed by employees. This decision may be based on several factors. How is the chemical used? Where it is used? Is there any ventilation concerns? How much of the chemical is used? Air sampling or testing results? How long the chemical is used? Other considerations. For example, a precautionary statement may state, wear respiratory protection. However, employees may not be required to wear a respirator based on the employer's evaluation of the factors listed above: how, where, how much, time, and the permissible exposure limit. Now we're going to move into label identification. Product identifier means the name or number used for a hazardous chemical on a label or in the SDS. It provides a unique means by which the user can identify the chemical. The product identifier used shall permit cross-references to be made among the list of hazardous chemicals required in the Written Hazard Communication Program. Secondary container labels. Each container of a hazardous chemical in the workplace shall be labeled. Secondary labeling systems are still permitted, but they must be consistent with the revised HAZCOM standard. This chart shows the new health hazard class and the hazard categories. On the left-hand column, it shows you the old, with 1 being combustible liquid and 4 being extremely flammable liquid and vapor. With the new revision, on the columns on the right, it shows you 1 being extremely flammable and 4 being least hazardous. They are reversed to what they used to be. Manufacturers, importers, and distributors must classify all hazards for their products. Secondary container labels. You cannot have conflicting hazard warnings or pictograms. You may be able to use written materials in lieu of affixing labels to individual stationary process containers. Employers may be able to use the GHS compliant labels, which is the same as shipping. The difference between GHS versus HMIS and NFPA is NFPA and HMIS systems still indicate 4 being severe hazard and 1 being the least hazardous. Under GHS HAZCOM standard, when your manufacturer, importer, distributor classifies a chemical at Category 4 as a least severe and Category 1 is the most severe. Under the new HAZCOM standard, Material Safety Data Sheets, or MSDS, are now called Safety Data Sheets, SDS. All SDSs will have a consistent 16-section format. Employers must ensure that the SDSs are readily accessible to employees prior to exposing of the hazard. Now we're going to break down the safety data sheets. Section 1 covers identification, includes product identifier, manufacturer or distributor name, address, phone number, emergency phone number, recommended use, restrictions on use. Section 2 covers hazard identification, includes all hazards regarding the chemical and the required label elements. Section 3, composition and information on ingredients, includes information on chemical ingredients and trade secret claims. Section 4 covers first aid measures, includes important symptoms, effects, acute, delayed, and required treatment. Section 5 covers firefighting measures, lists suitable extinguishing techniques, equipment, chemical hazards from a fire. Section 6, accidental release measures, lists emergency procedures, protective equipment, and proper methods of containment and cleanup. Section 7, handling and storage, lists precautions for safe handling and storage, including incompatibilities. Section 8, exposure controls and personal protection, lists OSHA's permissible exposure limits, the threshold limit values, and appropriate engineering controls and personal protective equipment. Section 9 covers physical and chemical properties, lists the chemical's characteristics. Section 10, stability and reactivity, lists chemical stability and possibility of hazardous reactions. Section 11, toxicological information, includes routes of exposure, related symptoms, acute and chronic effects, and numerical measures of toxicity. Section 12, ecological information. Section 13, disposal consideration. Section 14, transport information. Section 15, regulatory information. Section 16, other information including date of preparation of last revision. Please note, OSHA will not be enforcing sections 12 through 15 due to other agencies regulating this information. Now for review. SDS, Safety Data Sheets, replaced Material Safety Data Sheets, or MSDS. SDS have a standardized 16-section format. There are only 2 signal words, danger and warning. There will be no conflicting hazard warnings or pictograms. Each container of a hazardous chemical in the workplace shall be labeled. SDSs shall be readily available to employees upon request prior to using the hazardous chemical. Know what you are using and the properties that it contains, as it could save you or a fellow coworker's life.